What if the reason that your surfing hasn't improved lately is not because of your board, it's not because of your strength, and it's not because you don't surf enough, but rather it's because of the way that you practice and train your surfing? If you've ever felt that your surfing has plateaued, you're catching waves, you're making sections, but you're just not leveling up your surfing. Today, I'm going to show you a simple framework that explains why most surfers plateau in the intermediate level and how to break through it guaranteed. Stick around because this way of thinking can completely change the way that you approach your surf training. As with all things in life, surf progression is not linear or the same for everybody. But most people feel satisfied as long as they feel like they're progressing and maybe they're better than their friends. That said, there are some common patterns in the surf journey. One of the biggest patterns we see, especially in surfers without a regular coach, is that they tend to plateau at the mid-intermediate level. Up to that point, surfing was mostly a volume and exposure game. You went surfing more often, you caught more waves, your paddle and your pop-up became passable, you could trim down the line, maybe do a few basic turns. And that's what I would describe as mid-intermediate level. And that's where most people get stuck. But here's the key shift that most surfers miss. After that level, exposure alone is no longer the key factor in driving your progression. From here on out, the number one factor in your progression for surfing becomes technical improvement. We've all heard and probably used the phrase that practice makes perfect, which is actually misleading. A more accurate saying would be that practice makes permanent. And herein lies the reason for the plateau. If you're practicing poor technique every time you paddle out, you're not just failing to progress. You're ingraining those motor patterns deeper and deeper. And the longer you surf, the longer it's going to take to unlearn those bad habits. And that's why I prefer the saying, perfect practice makes perfect. But perfect practice requires knowledge, understanding, intentional focus, and an honest awareness of your own abilities and habits. And this is where the key to continual surf progression emerges. Let me introduce you to constraint-based surf training. This concept has two meanings and both are powerful. First, let's look at the big picture. Imagine your surfing progression as a hot air balloon. The balloon wants to rise, but it's held down by multiple ropes. Each rope represents a different constraint in your surfing. Paddling, positioning, pop-up, foot placement, and so on. No matter how much effort you put in, the balloon can only rise as high as the shortest rope allows. That shortest rope represents your primary bottleneck. Your job as a student of surfing is to identify which constraint is currently limiting your progression and address that one first. When you do, the balloon rises until it's limited by the next shortest rope. Fix that, then the next, and then the next. And that's how real long-term progression is achieved. Now here's the second meaning for the term constraint-based surf training. And this is where it gets practical. Once you've identified your primary bottleneck, you need to constrain all other elements of your training to that one specific item. Now let's take, for example, paddling. You've identified paddling as your number one constraint, either through your own observation or perhaps from a coach or a friend that's informed you that your paddling sucks. Instead of trying to improve everything at once, you constrain your focus just to your paddling. But if you're like me, paddling out on a cracking day just to practice your paddling is never going to happen. So we train out of the water so that we can play in the water. But your training also requires a constraint-based approach with a focus specifically and always first on technique. Once you have established a terrific technique and eliminated your bad habits, Then you focus on layering strength and endurance on top of your already good technique. The payoff, after weeks of focused paddle training, you start to notice the shift. You can paddle out into the lineup easier with less fatigue. You're positioning yourself in the lineup quicker and more efficiently, and you're just generally catching more waves. And then something else opens up. You get the privilege of identifying your next bottleneck. Maybe it's your pop-up, maybe it's your timing, maybe it's your upper body rotation on your turns. Whatever it is, identify the next bottleneck, focus your training on technique, and then layer strength and endurance on top of that until you improve and move on to the next bottleneck. And you just repeat that again and again. And that constraint-based surf training is your secret weapon to continual surfing progression.